Challengers seeking to disqualify former President Trump from appearing on Maine's presidential primary ballot next year had a hearing in Augusta today. Kenichi Lawrence has more.
Maine's election officials heard from the challengers seeking to block former President Donald Trump from being on the state's primary ballot next year. Secretary of State Shanna Bellows also heard from Trump's attorneys, who questioned her authority as the presiding officer.
The challengers here have argued that you have authority to enforce Section 3, the disqualification of Section 3. And one of our responses is that you don't. So there's nothing in Maine statute, nothing that gives her any explicit authority to remove someone under the 14th Amendment.
One of the challengers, Benjamin Gaines, disagrees.
The legislature clearly delegated the authority to the secretary to evaluate the qualifications of the candidates.
That includes federal office. Part of the challengers' focus was on Trump's involvement in the January 6th Capitol riots.
We believe former President Trump on January 6th engaged in an insurrection against the Constitution of the United States.
He refused to act to stop the assault on the Capitol, on the members of Congress, and on those sworn to protect the members of Congress.
That, they say, disqualifies him from the presidential office.
I am asking you, as Secretary of State, to focus only on the presidential oath of office requirement to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, and what a violation of the presidential oath of office means to Maine.
During cross-examination, Trump's attorneys asked if Trump met the 3 qualifications listed in the Constitution for the presidency.
Do you believe he's been a resident of the United States for at least 14 years?
I have no reason to believe otherwise.
And do you believe he's at least 35 years of age?
I definitely have reason to believe that's true.
This is tantamount. It is basically election interference. People should have the right to vote for President Trump, or the right to vote against him if they don't want to, but they should have the right to vote for him, and he has the right to stand before people to get their votes.
Kenichi Lawrence, WABI TV5 News, Augusta.
Secretary Bellows will rule on the validity of the challenges by the end of next week. A challenger or the candidate can appeal the decision in court.